Every successful person has a moment they wish the world could forget, a moment when hope feels more expensive than survival. For David Walker, that moment arrived on a freezing November night in Chicago. Rain tapped softly against the windows of an aging Honda Civic parked beneath an overpass. The engine had stopped hours earlier because there was barely enough gasoline left to keep the heater running. In the back seat, wrapped in an old blanket that had lost its warmth years ago, 7-year-old Noah slowly opened his eyes. He looked at the fog covering the windows before turning toward his father, who pretended to be reading job listings on a cracked phone with only 3% battery remaining. Noah quietly asked the question David had spent weeks praying he would never hear. "Dad, are we homeless?" David forced a smile, even though every word felt like glass inside his chest. He gently brushed his son's hair and answered, "No, buddy, we are just camping for a little while. Sometimes life gives us strange adventures before it gives us something better." Noah smiled because children naturally believe the people they trust most. He closed his eyes again and whispered that camping with Dad was actually fun. David waited until Noah fell asleep before lowering his head onto the steering wheel. Tears rolled silently down his face. He had failed to protect the one person who believed he could do anything. Just 6 months earlier, life looked completely different. David worked as a warehouse supervisor for a logistics company, earning enough to rent a modest apartment and keep food on the table. He was never rich, but every Friday evening Noah waited excitedly by the apartment window because his father always came home carrying a small pizza they'd while watching old basketball games together. Those nights felt like proof that happiness never depended on luxury. Then everything changed in a single afternoon. The company announced an unexpected merger. Entire departments disappeared overnight. David and hundreds of other employees were escorted from the building carrying cardboard boxes filled with photographs, coffee mugs, and years of loyalty that suddenly meant nothing. He searched for another job immediately, convinced someone with 15 years of experience would quickly find work. Instead, interview after interview ended the same way. Employers praised his qualifications before explaining they had chosen another candidate. Bills continued arriving even after hope stopped visiting. His savings disappeared. Credit cards reached their limits. Collection agencies began calling every day. Then the landlord posted an eviction notice on the apartment door. David packed everything he and Noah owned into the little Honda, selling nearly all their furniture just to buy another few weeks of food. Noah never complained. He believed the apartment was being repaired, and that sleeping in the car was simply another temporary adventure. Every lie David told came from love rather than pride. The following morning they washed their faces inside a gas station restroom before driving to Noah's elementary school. David always parked 2 streets away because he never wanted teachers or classmates to discover where they had spent the night. After dropping Noah off, he changed into the only suit he still owned and walked nearly 4 miles to another job interview because he could not afford parking downtown. The receptionist barely looked at him before handing him another application. 2 hours later, the hiring manager apologized politely and explained that although David impressed everyone, they were looking for someone with recent experience using a newer logistics software system. David thanked him anyway and walked back outside beneath grey skies that seemed determined to follow him everywhere. As he reached the sidewalk, he noticed an elderly man struggling to carry several heavy grocery bags after one of them burst open. Apples rolled across the pavement while busy pedestrians stepped around the mess without stopping. David immediately knelt beside the stranger and helped gather every item. The older man smiled warmly and introduced himself as Charles Bennett. During their brief conversation, Charles asked whether David worked nearby. David hesitated before admitting he had just finished another unsuccessful interview. Charles studied him for a moment before removing a business card from his wallet. He explained that he owned a small investment firm and occasionally searched for interns willing to learn financial analysis from the ground up. The position paid very little during training, and most applicants quit within weeks because the workload was overwhelming. David almost laughed. He had never worked in finance, never attended business school, and barely understood the stock market. Charles simply smiled, and David barely slept that night. Every hour he woke up to check whether Noah was still covered by the old blanket, then glanced at the dashboard clock, wondering if tomorrow would finally be different from every disappointing day that came before it. Before sunrise, he quietly started the car, drove to a 24-hour gas station, and used the restroom to help Noah get ready for school. Noah cheerfully brushed his teeth while humming the song his music teacher had taught the class the previous week. He had no idea his father was counting every remaining dollar inside his wallet. After buying the cheapest breakfast they could find, David dropped Noah off at school with a smile that hid every ounce of fear inside him. As Noah ran toward the entrance, he suddenly turned around and shouted, "Dad, good luck today. I know you are going to get the job." Those simple words echoed in David's mind during the entire drive downtown. Charles Bennett's investment firm occupied only one floor of an aging office building. It looked nothing like the glamorous financial companies David had imagined. The furniture was simple, the walls displayed old photographs instead of expensive artwork, and the receptionist greeted every visitor by name. At exactly 8 o'clock, Charles appeared carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to David and invited him into a conference room where 5 other applicants were already waiting. David immediately realized he was the oldest person there. The others wore expensive suits, carried university folders, and casually discussed finance, economics, and investment strategies. David quietly took the last empty seat, feeling completely out of place. Charles welcomed everyone and explained that only one person would receive the internship. The salary during the 6-month training period would barely cover basic living expenses, and no one would be guaranteed a permanent position afterward. Several applicants exchanged nervous glances. One young man even whispered that he had expected something much better. Charles smiled but continued speaking. He explained that success in finance was not built on intelligence alone. Markets changed every day. Technology evolved constantly. The one quality that never lost value was integrity. Then he handed everyone a folder containing financial statements from a struggling manufacturing company. Their first assignment was simple: identify the biggest risk facing the business and explain how they would save it. David stared at the unfamiliar numbers, feeling panic rise inside him. The accounting terms meant almost nothing to him. Around the room, pens moved confidently across paper while calculators clicked non-stop. David closed his eyes for a moment and remembered something his father used to tell him as a child. When you do not understand the numbers, understand the people behind them. Instead of focusing only on spreadsheets, David began reading employee reports, customer complaints, shipping delays, and production notes attached to the file. Patterns slowly appeared. The company did not suffer because sales were weak. It suffered because products reached customers too late due to poor warehouse organization. Logistics. That was the language David had spoken for 15 years. When time expired, each applicant presented their solution. Most recommended layoffs, budget cuts, and higher prices. David spoke last. Instead of eliminating workers, he explained how reorganizing inventory, improving delivery schedules, and reducing transportation waste could save millions without firing loyal employees. Charles listened carefully without interrupting. When David finished, the room became unusually quiet. After the interviews ended, Charles asked David to stay behind. He admitted David knew almost nothing about finance, yet he was the only applicant who looked beyond the balance sheet and saw the people keeping the company alive. Charles offered him the internship immediately. The salary was modest, but it was enough to give David a chance. Tears almost filled David's eyes as he accepted. For the first time in months, he believed life was finally changing. His happiness lasted less than an hour. As he walked toward the parking lot, his phone rang repeatedly. The number belonged to Noah's school. His heart instantly sank. When he answered, the principal explained that Noah had developed a high fever and needed to be picked up immediately. David rushed across the city, arriving to find his son asleep on a bench inside the nurse's office. The school nurse quietly explained that Noah likely needed a doctor because his temperature continued rising. David thanked her and carried his son back to the car. He drove to the nearest medical clinic only to learn that Noah's health insurance had expired after David lost his job. The receptionist politely explained the examination fee would have to be paid before treatment. David looked inside his wallet. After buying breakfast and gasoline that morning, he had less than $40 remaining. The examination alone cost more than 3 times that amount. Holding his feverish son in his arms, David felt the fragile hope he had discovered only hours earlier beginning to slip away once again. At that exact moment, someone gently placed a hand on his shoulder. David turned around and froze. Standing behind him was Charles Bennett, who quietly asked only one question: "Why didn't you tell me how bad things really?" David stood speechless as Charles Bennett repeated the question, his calm voice carrying more concern than judgment. For several long seconds, David could not answer. He looked down at Noah sleeping against his shoulder, his small face flushed with fever, then back at the man who had offered him the first opportunity he had received in months. Finally, he admitted the truth. After losing his job, he had exhausted every dollar of savings, sold nearly everything he owned, lost his apartment, and had been living in his car with Noah for almost 3 weeks. He confessed that every morning he parked several blocks away from the school because he never wanted his son to feel embarrassed. He admitted that he had almost declined the internship because he was unsure whether he could even afford enough gasoline to drive to the office every day. Charles listened without interrupting, his expression never changing. When David finished speaking, he expected sympathy, or worse, pity. Instead, Charles walked to the reception desk, quietly paid for Noah's examination, and thanked the nurse for taking care of the boy. David immediately insisted he would repay every cent as soon as he received his first paycheck. Charles smiled and replied that money was the easiest debt to repay. Trust was much harder. Noah was examined within minutes. The doctor explained that he had a serious viral infection made worse by exhaustion and cold nights sleeping inside the car. Fortunately, it could be treated with medication and several days of proper rest. Those last words struck David harder than anything else. Proper rest. He had nowhere to take his son except the back seat of an old Honda. As they left the examination room, Charles asked David to sit with him in the waiting area. He did not ask why David had hidden his situation. He already understood. Pride often survived long after money disappeared. Instead, Charles told him a story from his own youth. 40 years earlier, he had arrived in Chicago with 2 suitcases, no family, no connections, and barely enough money to eat for a week. He worked nights cleaning office buildings while studying accounting during the day. More than once he slept inside those same office buildings after everyone else had gone home because he could not afford rent. The only reason he eventually escaped poverty was because one elderly business owner believed character mattered more than credentials. Charles looked directly into David's eyes and said that every successful life was built on someone else's act of kindness. The only question was whether that kindness would eventually be passed forward. David lowered his head, overwhelmed by gratitude. Before he could speak, Charles handed him a small envelope containing the keys to a furnished company apartment normally reserved for visiting clients. He explained that the apartment had remained empty for several months and would stay available until David got back on his feet. David immediately refused, insisting he could not accept something so generous. Charles interrupted him with a gentle smile. "This is not charity. This is an investment. If I believe you can change your life, then I have to prove it before expecting you to believe it yourself." Tears filled David's eyes as he quietly accepted the keys. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Noah fell asleep in a real bed. Before closing his eyes, he looked around the small apartment and whispered that camping must finally be over. David laughed softly before kissing his son's forehead. He promised that one day they would have a place they could truly call home. The next morning, David arrived at the investment firm nearly an hour early. While the office remained quiet, he studied every finance book he could find, filling notebook after notebook with unfamiliar terms, formulas, and investment principles. He knew he was competing against people with university degrees, so he decided he would compensate by working harder than anyone else. Days quickly became weeks. David stayed after everyone left, volunteered for assignments nobody wanted, and spent evenings watching recorded lectures on financial markets while Noah completed homework beside him in the company apartment. Slowly, the impossible began to feel possible. His confidence grew with every small success. Coworkers who initially questioned why an unemployed warehouse supervisor had been hired gradually started asking for his opinion on logistics and operations. David discovered that businesses were not simply collections of numbers. They were living systems where people, timing, leadership, and trust mattered just as much as profit. One Friday afternoon, Charles invited David into his office with an unusually serious expression. A major client was considering purchasing a struggling transportation company that had lost millions of dollars over the previous 3 years. Every senior analyst recommended rejecting the investment because the financial statements looked disastrous. Charles placed the file on David's desk and asked for his opinion before Monday morning. David carried the thick folder home that evening, unaware that the decision he made over the next 48 hours would not only determine the future of the investment firm, but also become the turning point that would change his own life forever. David carried the transportation company file home that Friday evening, placing it carefully on the small kitchen table while Noah colored pictures beside him. Most people would have spent the weekend studying financial statements, but David knew he had something the senior analysts did not. He understood warehouses, truck routes, delivery schedules, and the countless small problems that never appeared on a spreadsheet. After Noah fell asleep, David spent nearly the entire night reading every page inside the report. The numbers looked terrible at first glance. Revenue had declined for 3 consecutive years, operating expenses continued rising, and investors had almost completely lost confidence. Yet as he read deeper, he noticed something strange. Fuel costs were unusually high compared to companies of similar size. Delivery trucks frequently returned empty after completing shipments, doubling transportation expenses. Warehouses remained overcrowded while customers complained about delayed deliveries. None of those problems suggested a failing business. They suggested terrible management. Early Saturday morning, David drove across the city to visit several distribution centers owned by the company. Although the facilities were officially closed for the weekend, he introduced himself to security guards and politely asked whether he could observe the loading areas from outside. Most people would have refused, but David spoke the language of warehouse workers. Within minutes, several employees began sharing stories about outdated software, poor scheduling, and executives who had never stepped inside the facilities they managed. One veteran truck driver laughed as he explained that every employee already knew how to save the company, but nobody inside headquarters ever listened. David filled an entire notebook with observations before driving to another location. By Sunday afternoon, his notebook contained far more practical information than the financial report itself. He realized the business was not dying because customers had disappeared. It was bleeding money because leadership had ignored the people doing the actual work. That evening, David prepared a presentation unlike anything Charles or the other analysts expected. Instead of recommending against the investment, he proposed purchasing the company at its discounted value and rebuilding its entire logistics network. He suggested replacing inefficient delivery routes, modernizing warehouse operations, investing in employee training, and promoting experienced supervisors instead of hiring expensive outside executives. He even estimated that the company could return to profitability within 18 months if the changes were implemented correctly. Monday morning, the conference room filled with senior analysts ready to dismiss the investment. One by one, they presented detailed charts explaining why acquiring the transportation company would be too risky. Charles listened carefully before inviting David to speak last. David walked to the front of the room carrying nothing more than his notebook. Rather than focusing on balance sheets, he described the people he had met over the weekend. He spoke about truck drivers who wasted hours because of poor scheduling, warehouse employees forced to work around outdated systems, and loyal customers who still believed in the company despite repeated delays. Then he explained that businesses rarely failed because hard-working employees stopped caring. They failed because leaders stopped listening. The room remained silent. Several analysts exchanged skeptical glances, but Charles continued listening without interrupting. When David finished, one senior executive challenged him directly, arguing that emotional stories could never replace financial analysis. David calmly replied that he agreed completely. Then he revealed the calculations hidden inside his notebook, showing exactly how operational improvements would reduce costs by millions of dollars each year. Every figure was supported by real observations from the facilities he had visited. The skepticism slowly disappeared. For the first time since joining the firm, David saw experienced investors taking notes while he spoke. After the meeting, Charles asked everyone except David to leave the room. Closing the door behind the last analyst, he smiled proudly and admitted that David had just done something very few professionals ever accomplished. He had looked beyond the numbers and discovered the real value hidden inside a struggling business. Charles immediately approved the investment and assigned David to assist with the restructuring project. It was the biggest opportunity of his career, but it also came with enormous responsibility. If the turnaround failed, both Charles and David would lose the confidence of every major client. That afternoon, David picked Noah up from school earlier than usual. They celebrated with 2 slices of pizza from a small neighborhood restaurant, the same meal they used to share before life fell apart. Noah noticed his father smiling more than he had in months and innocently asked if they were finally becoming lucky again. David looked at his son and quietly answered that luck had very little to do with it. Good people had simply given them another chance, and now it was his responsibility to prove they were right. As they walked back toward the apartment, David received an unexpected phone call from the firm's receptionist. Her voice sounded unusually urgent. Charles Bennett had collapsed inside his office only minutes after the meeting and had been rushed to the hospital. Before losing consciousness, he left only one instruction: tell David to come immediately. David's heart pounded as he rushed through the hospital entrance, still wearing the same suit he had worn to the office that morning. The receptionist directed him toward the intensive care unit where several employees from Bennett Capital had already gathered in silence. Everyone looked anxious. Charles Bennett was not only the founder of the firm, he was the reason many of them had careers at all. After several minutes, a doctor walked into the waiting area and explained that Charles had suffered a mild heart attack brought on by years of stress and overwork. The good news was that he was expected to recover. The bad news was that he would need several months away from the office, possibly longer. David felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it lasted only a moment. One of Charles's assistants approached and quietly informed him that Charles had specifically requested to see him before being transferred to a recovery room. David entered the room slowly, unsure why he had been called instead of one of the firm's senior partners. Charles looked weak, yet the familiar warmth in his eyes remained unchanged. He smiled as David sat beside the bed and apologized for ruining what should have been a successful Monday. David shook his head and thanked him for everything he had already done. Charles reached toward the bedside table and handed David a small leather notebook that looked decades old. He explained that throughout his career, he had written down every lesson he wished someone had taught him when he was young. Inside were notes about business, leadership, failure, trust, and the difficult decisions that defined a person's character more than their success ever could. Charles asked David to keep the notebook until he returned to work. Then his expression became more serious. He admitted that the investment firm was about to face enormous pressure. Several wealthy clients had already questioned the decision to invest in the struggling transportation company. If the restructuring failed, they would likely withdraw millions of dollars and force the company into crisis. David quietly promised that he would do everything possible to make the investment succeed. Charles smiled and replied that he already knew that. The reason he trusted David had nothing to do with talent. It was because David never forgot the people behind every business decision. Before leaving the room, David thanked Charles once again. As he reached the door, Charles called his name one final time. Without looking away, he said something David would remember for the rest of his life. Never let success convince you that you are better than the people who believed in you before you had anything. The following morning, Bennett Capital felt completely different. Charles's office remained dark, employees spoke in hushed voices, and uncertainty spread through every department. Later that afternoon, an emergency partners meeting was called. David expected to receive instructions about the restructuring project. Instead, he found himself sitting across from three senior partners who had opposed Charles's decision to hire him from the very beginning. One of them, William Harper, wasted no time expressing his opinion. He argued that Charles had allowed emotion to cloud his judgment by promoting an inexperienced intern into one of the firm's most important projects. Another partner suggested canceling the transportation company acquisition before investors lost confidence. David listened quietly until they finally asked for his response. He stood, placed his notebook on the conference table, and calmly explained every operational improvement already planned for the company. He presented updated financial projections, cost reductions, employee retention strategies, and new client contracts that were already being negotiated. By the time he finished speaking, even the most skeptical partner admitted the plan was stronger than expected. Still, William remained unconvinced. He challenged David to prove his strategy within 90 days. If the company failed to show measurable improvement, the restructuring would end immediately and David would lose his position. David accepted the challenge without hesitation. Over the next several weeks, his life became a relentless cycle of work and fatherhood. He spent mornings visiting warehouses, afternoons meeting managers, evenings reviewing logistics reports, and nights helping Noah with homework before studying financial models long after his son had fallen asleep. Employees who once expected another executive to lecture them were surprised to find David loading trucks beside them, walking warehouse floors, and asking questions instead of giving orders. Little by little, morale improved. Delivery times became faster. Customer complaints declined. Fuel costs dropped as routes were redesigned. For the first time in years, workers believed someone inside management actually understood what they did every day. Then, exactly 60 days into the restructuring, Bennett Capital received the first quarterly report. Revenue had increased beyond expectations. Operating costs had fallen sharply. Most importantly, the transportation company reported its first monthly profit in nearly 4 years. The office erupted in celebration. David allowed himself a rare smile as employees congratulated one another. It seemed the impossible had finally become reality. But before anyone could enjoy the victory, the conference room fell silent as William Harper slowly placed thick legal file in the center of the table. Every executive stared at the documents while the firm's attorneys quickly flipped through the pages. The lawsuit had been filed by Sterling Horizon Capital, one of the largest private investment groups in the Midwest. According to the complaint, Sterling claimed it had signed a confidential agreement months earlier giving the firm exclusive rights to purchase the struggling transportation company if certain financial conditions were met. If the agreement proved valid, Bennett Capital could lose not only the company it had spent months rebuilding, but also millions of dollars invested in the restructuring. William folded his arms and looked directly at David. Without raising his voice, he quietly reminded everyone that this was exactly the type of disaster he had predicted when Charles Bennett chose an inexperienced intern to lead the project. Several board members exchanged worried glances. The celebration that had filled the office only minutes earlier disappeared completely. David asked the attorneys one simple question. Had anyone verified whether the agreement was authentic? The lead attorney admitted they had not. Sterling's lawyers had delivered the complaint less than 30 minutes earlier, leaving very little time to examine the evidence. David requested permission to review every document personally before anyone discussed settlement options. William laughed softly and suggested that legal contracts were probably beyond David's experience. David ignored the remark. He carried the files into a quiet meeting room and began reading every page one by one. Hours passed as employees slowly left the office. Long after sunset, only a few lights remained on. Noah sat quietly beside his father doing homework while David highlighted every unusual detail inside the contract. Something did not feel right. The signatures appeared genuine, the language looked professional, yet several shipping facility addresses listed in the agreement belonged to warehouses that had been demolished years before the contract was supposedly signed. David immediately searched public property records and confirmed his suspicion. At least 3 locations described inside the agreement no longer existed on the date printed on the document. It was impossible for an experienced legal team to make such a basic mistake, unless they had copied information from much older paperwork. The next morning, David arrived before everyone else and met privately with the firm's attorneys. Together they uncovered additional inconsistencies. Company registration numbers referenced businesses that had changed ownership long before the alleged agreement. Several notarized pages contained outdated state filing codes that had been replaced years earlier. By the time the partners gathered for an emergency meeting, the legal team had reached an extraordinary conclusion. The contract appeared to be a sophisticated forgery. William looked genuinely surprised as the attorneys presented their findings. Before anyone could celebrate, another unexpected visitor arrived. 2 federal investigators entered the conference room carrying official identification. They explained that Sterling Horizon Capital had been under investigation for several months on suspicion of corporate fraud involving distressed companies. The forged agreement delivered to Bennett Capital matched the pattern investigators had been tracking across multiple states. David realized the transportation company had never been the true target. Sterling had waited until Bennett Capital invested millions rebuilding the business before attempting to steal it through fraudulent legal claims. The investigators requested complete cooperation, including access to every communication received from Sterling during the past week. David immediately agreed. Over the following days, Bennett Capital worked closely with federal authorities while continuing the company's turnaround. Employees remained focused despite the uncertainty because David insisted that fear should never interrupt honest work. His attitude spread quickly throughout the organization. Warehouse supervisors volunteered extra hours, drivers suggested new efficiency improvements, and customer satisfaction reached its highest level in years. One Friday afternoon, Charles Bennett surprised everyone by walking into the office much earlier than his doctors had recommended. Although he still looked weaker than before, the smile on his face returned the moment he saw employees working together. The entire office applauded as he slowly walked through the hallway, shaking hands with people who had kept the company moving during his absence. When he reached David's desk, he noticed the old leather notebook resting beside stacks of logistics reports. Charles quietly asked whether David had learned anything useful from it. David smiled and replied that the most valuable lesson was not written inside the notebook at all. It was watching Charles live by every principle he had written down. Charles laughed softly before inviting David into his office. Closing the door behind them, he admitted he had already made an important decision while recovering in the hospital. Regardless of how the Sterling investigation ended, he wanted David to become a full partner in Bennett Capital. David stared at him in complete disbelief. Only a few months earlier, he had been sleeping in his car wondering how to buy breakfast for his son. Now, one of the most respected investors in the city was offering him a partnership. Before David could respond, David froze as the principal repeated the words. A woman claiming to be Noah's biological mother was waiting in the school office and demanding custody of the child. For a moment he thought he had misheard. 6 years had passed since Melissa walked out of their lives. 6 years without a phone call, without a birthday card, without a single attempt to ask whether Noah was healthy or happy. She had simply disappeared one afternoon after announcing that motherhood was preventing her from pursuing the life she wanted. David remembered standing in the apartment doorway holding a crying toddler while Melissa loaded her belongings into a car and drove away without looking back. Since that day, every scraped knee, every school project, every doctor's appointment, every bedtime story had been handled by him alone. Now she had suddenly returned. Charles immediately noticed the color draining from David's face. After hearing the situation, he insisted David leave the office and handle the matter immediately. David thanked him and rushed toward Noah's school with a mixture of confusion, anger, and fear twisting inside his chest. The drive felt endless. By the time he arrived, his hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Inside the principal's office, Noah sat quietly in a chair looking frightened and confused. Beside him stood a woman David almost failed to recognize. Melissa looked older, more polished, and far more confident than the person he remembered. Expensive clothes and designer accessories suggested she had been living a very different life during the years she had been absent. The moment she saw David, she stood and crossed her arms. Noah immediately ran to his father and wrapped both arms around his waist. That single gesture said more than any courtroom argument ever could. Melissa explained that she had recently returned to Chicago after living in California and wanted to rebuild a relationship with her son. David replied that rebuilding a relationship and demanding custody were two very different things. Melissa's expression hardened. She revealed that she had already hired attorneys and intended to pursue legal action if necessary. According to her, Noah deserved a stable life and greater opportunities than David could provide. The words felt like a slap across the face. She had no idea where Noah had slept during those difficult weeks in the car. She had never seen David skip meals so his son could eat. She had not been there during the nights. Noah cried from fever while David sat awake, terrified of losing him. Yet now she was questioning his ability to be a father. The principal wisely ended the meeting before the argument escalated further. David took Noah home, but neither of them spoke much during the drive. Finally, as they entered the apartment, Noah quietly asked the question David had been dreading. "Is she really my mom?" David sat beside his son and told him the truth. Yes, she was his mother. Noah thought for a long moment before asking another question. Then why didn't she stay? David felt his heart break. He wanted to express years of pain and disappointment, but he refused to poison his son's heart with bitterness. Instead, he simply explained that sometimes adults make choices they later regret. Noah nodded slowly but did not seem satisfied. That night, after Noah fell asleep, David sat alone staring out the apartment window. For the first time in months, he felt powerless. He knew how to solve business problems. He knew how to rebuild failing companies. But there was no spreadsheet capable of calculating the fear of losing a child. The following week, the custody battle officially began. Melissa's attorneys moved aggressively. They argued that she was financially successful, owned a home, and could provide opportunities unavailable to David. They carefully avoided discussing her years of absence. David's attorney assured him that courts rarely ignored such a long period of abandonment, but uncertainty remained. Every hearing, every document, every legal motion felt like another attack on the life he and Noah had fought so hard to rebuild. Then an unexpected development changed everything. One afternoon, Noah's teacher requested a private meeting with both attorneys. During the meeting, she presented a collection of school assignments completed by Noah over the previous 3 years. One essay described his hero. Another asked students to write about the person they trusted most. A third required them to draw their family. Every single project centered on David. In one essay, Noah wrote that his father never quit, even when life became scary. In another, he described David as the bravest person he had ever known, because he always smiled when things were difficult. Several adults in the room struggled to hide their emotions while reading the pages. Melissa remained silent. For perhaps the first time, she realized she was not competing against David. She was competing against 6 years of love, sacrifice, and memories she had chosen to miss. The case continued for several weeks until the judge scheduled a final hearing. David believed the worst was nearly over. Then, only 3 days before the decision, another shocking surprise arrived. A private investigator hired by Melissa's legal team delivered photographs showing David and Noah living in their car months earlier. The attorneys planned to use the images as evidence that David had once been unable to provide a stable home. As David stared at the photographs, memories of those painful nights came rushing back. He wondered whether the very struggle he had overcome might now be used to take away the person he had sacrificed everything to protect. The final hearing was approaching, and for the first time since Melissa returned, David was no longer certain how The courthouse was already crowded when David arrived on the morning of the final custody hearing. Reporters filled the front steps because Bennett Capital had recently become one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the city, and news of a successful young partner fighting to keep custody of his son had attracted public attention. David ignored every camera pointed toward him. Holding Noah's small hand, he walked through the courthouse entrance with quiet determination. Noah looked up at his father and asked whether everything would be okay. David knelt beside him and smiled the same reassuring smile he had worn on the night they slept inside the old Honda. He gently promised that no matter what happened inside the courtroom, They would always be a family. Noah hugged him tightly before a court officer escorted him to a waiting room. Inside the courtroom, Melissa sat beside her legal team wearing an expensive navy suit, projecting confidence that seemed carefully rehearsed. David noticed she looked nervous whenever Noah's name was mentioned, but her attorneys remained aggressive. They opened the hearing by presenting photographs of David and Noah living in the car months earlier. Enlarged images appeared on large display screens, showing blankets covering the back seat, grocery bags stacked beside school books, and David sleeping upright behind the steering wheel. The attorney argued that no child should ever experience such conditions and claimed Melissa could provide a safer, wealthier future. David listened quietly without interrupting. Every photograph reminded him of nights he wished Noah would never remember. When it was his attorney's turn, she did something unexpected. Instead of denying the photographs, she accepted every one of them as authentic. She told the judge that the pictures showed something far more important than poverty. They showed a father who refused to abandon his child when life became unbearable. She then presented employment records proving David had applied for more than 100 jobs before finally receiving an opportunity at Bennett Capital. Medical receipts showed he had skipped treatment for his own back injury to pay for Noah's medicine. Bank statements revealed nearly every dollar David earned during those difficult months had been spent on food, school supplies, and rent. Finally, she called Charles Bennett as a witness. The courtroom grew silent as the respected businessman slowly walked to the stand. Charles spoke calmly about the day he first met David outside the grocery store. He described seeing a man who helped a stranger without expecting anything in return, despite clearly struggling himself. Charles admitted he had no idea David was homeless until finding him at the medical clinic with Noah. He looked directly at the judge and said that in 40 years of business, he had invested millions of dollars into companies, but the best investment he had ever made was believing in David Walker. He explained that success had never changed David's priorities. Even after becoming a partner at Bennett Capital, David still left work early whenever Noah needed him, attended every school event, and never missed a parent-teacher conference. The courtroom remained completely silent. Then the judge surprised everyone by asking if Noah wished to speak privately in chambers. Both attorneys agreed. Several minutes later, Noah entered the judge's office accompanied only by a court counselor. Nobody heard the conversation. David waited outside feeling more helpless than ever before. Nearly half an hour later, the courtroom reconvened. The judge adjusted his glasses and slowly began reading the decision. He acknowledged Melissa's financial stability and recognized her legal rights as Noah's biological mother. However, he emphasized that custody decisions were never based solely on money or biology. They were based on the best interests of the child. The judge explained that Noah had formed an extraordinary emotional bond with the father who had raised him every single day of his life. He praised David's unwavering commitment during unimaginable hardship and ruled that full legal and physical custody would remain with David. Melissa would be granted supervised visitation if Noah wished to build a relationship over time. Tears filled David's eyes as relief swept through him. Noah immediately ran across the courtroom and threw his arms around his father. Even several court staff members quietly smiled at the emotional reunion. Melissa remained seated, staring silently at the floor. As everyone prepared to leave, she slowly approached David. For the first time since returning to Chicago, the confidence had disappeared from her face. She apologized for trying to erase years she could never recover. She admitted she had mistaken financial success for being a good parent. David listened quietly before telling her that Noah deserved the chance to know both of his parents, but trust could never be demanded. It had to be earned. Melissa nodded through tears before quietly walking away. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded David, asking how it felt to win such an emotional case. David simply looked at Noah standing beside him and answered that he had not won anything today. He had simply been reminded that love was something a child recognized long before a courtroom ever could. As they drove home together, Noel reached into his backpack and handed David a folded piece of paper. It was a classroom assignment asking students to write what they wanted to be when they grew up. In careful handwriting, Noel had written only one sentence: "I want to become the kind of man my dad already is." David smiled through tears, unaware that the greatest challenge of his career was about to begin the very next morning, when Bennett Capital received an invitation to compete for the largest investment opportunity in the firm's entire history. Monday morning began like every other day at Bennett Capital, but the atmosphere inside the office felt noticeably different. Employees gathered around televisions in the lobby as financial news channels announced that the city of Chicago was preparing to award a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure modernization project. The winning investment firm would oversee financing for new transportation hubs, logistics centers, and public distribution facilities over the next 10 years. It was the largest private investment opportunity the city had offered in decades. More than 20 of the country's biggest financial firms had already submitted proposals. Bennett Capital, despite its recent success, was considered a complete outsider. William Harper quietly remarked that they should not waste resources competing against corporations 10 times their size. Charles Bennett disagreed. He looked around the boardroom before asking a question that caught everyone by surprise. If we truly believe we build businesses by believing in people, then why should we believe we cannot compete simply because we are smaller? No one answered. Instead, Charles turned toward David and asked him to lead the presentation team. The room fell silent. Several senior executives expected William to receive the responsibility, but Charles had already made his decision. David accepted, fully aware that failure would not only damage his own reputation, but could cost the company clients who had trusted Bennett Capital for years. Over the next 3 weeks, the office transformed into a 24-hour operation. Analysts worked late into the night building financial models, while engineers prepared transportation forecasts and economists projected long-term regional growth. David insisted on doing something none of the larger firms considered necessary. Instead of relying only on consultants, he spent days meeting truck drivers, warehouse workers, small business owners, and neighborhood leaders who would actually use the new infrastructure. Many of them complained that previous projects had focused only on downtown development, while ignoring working-class communities, where transportation delays hurt families every single day. David filled another notebook with observations, just as he had months earlier when studying the struggling transportation company. Charles smiled when he noticed the familiar notebook growing thicker every evening. He knew David had not forgotten the lesson that first made him different. On the morning of the final presentation, representatives from every major investment firm gathered inside Chicago City Hall. Expensive suits, polished speeches, and sophisticated digital presentations filled the room. One after another, the competitors showcased impressive financial projections and promised record-breaking returns for investors. When Bennett Capital's turn arrived, several audience members barely looked up from their notes. They expected another routine proposal from a much smaller company. David walked to the podium carrying no flashy presentation, only the same worn notebook that had accompanied him since his first day at the firm. He began by telling the story of a warehouse employee who spent 3 extra hours every night because outdated transportation routes delayed deliveries across the city. Then he spoke about a family-owned grocery store losing customers because supply trucks regularly arrived late. Finally, he described a young father who once walked 4 miles to a job interview because reliable public transportation failed to connect his neighborhood with the business district. He never mentioned that the father was himself. Instead, he explained that infrastructure was not about roads or buildings. It was about giving ordinary people the chance to build extraordinary lives. Only after establishing that message did David present Bennett Capital's financial plan. Every investment recommendation was supported by real experiences gathered from the communities the project would serve. By the time he finished, the room that had expected another forgettable presentation rose to its feet in applause. Even executives from competing firms nodded respectfully. 2 weeks later, Bennett Capital received the official decision. Against every prediction, the city selected their proposal. Employees erupted in celebration as reporters crowded outside the office building. Charles quietly stepped aside, allowing David to address the media for the first time. Standing before dozens of cameras, David thanked the city for its confidence, but reminded everyone that the victory belonged to every employee who believed integrity could compete with size. That evening, Bennett Capital hosted a celebration attended by clients, city officials, and employees with their families. Noel proudly wore his first small suit and spent the evening introducing himself as his father's biggest fan. Watching him laugh with Charles brought tears to David's eyes. Just months earlier, they had shared hamburgers inside a parked car, wondering how they would survive another week. Now they stood surrounded by people celebrating what had once seemed impossible. As the evening drew to a close, Charles asked everyone for one final moment of attention. Holding a glass in his hand, he announced that after decades of leading Bennett Capital, he had decided it was time to retire. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Charles smiled before continuing. He revealed that the board had unanimously elected a new chief executive officer, effective immediately. Then he looked directly toward David. The entire room stood and applauded as Charles invited him to the stage. David remained frozen for several seconds, unable to believe what he was hearing. Only when Noah excitedly grabbed his hand did he finally walk toward the podium, accepting the position with tears in his eyes. Monday morning began like every other day at Bennett Capital, but the atmosphere inside the office felt noticeably different. Employees gathered around televisions in the lobby as financial news channels announced that the city of Chicago was preparing to award a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure modernization project. The winning investment firm would oversee financing for new transportation hubs, logistics centers, and public distribution facilities over the next 10 years. It was the largest private investment opportunity the city had offered in decades. More than 20 of the country's biggest financial firms had already submitted proposals. Bennett Capital, despite its recent success, was considered a complete outsider. William Harper quietly remarked that they should not waste resources competing against corporations 10 times their size. Charles Bennett disagreed. He looked around the boardroom before asking a question that caught everyone by surprise. If we truly believe we build businesses by believing in people, then why should we believe we cannot compete simply because we are smaller? No one answered. Instead, Charles turned toward David and asked him to lead the presentation team. The room fell silent. Several senior executives expected William to receive the responsibility, but Charles had already made his decision. David accepted, fully aware that failure would not only damage his own reputation, but could cost the company clients who had trusted Bennett Capital for years. Over the next 3 weeks, the office transformed into a 24-hour operation. Analysts worked late into the night building financial models, while engineers prepared transportation forecasts and economists projected long-term regional growth. David insisted on doing something none of the larger firms considered necessary. Instead of relying only on consultants, he spent days meeting truck drivers, warehouse workers, small business owners, and neighborhood leaders who would actually use the new infrastructure. Many of them complained that previous projects had focused only on downtown development, while ignoring working-class communities where transportation delays hurt families every single day. David filled another notebook with observations. just as he had months earlier when studying the struggling transportation company. Charles smiled when he noticed the familiar notebook growing thicker every evening. He knew David had not forgotten the lesson that first made him different. On the morning of the final presentation, representatives from every major investment firm gathered inside Chicago City Hall. Expensive suits, polished speeches, and sophisticated digital presentations filled the room. One after another, the competitors showcased impressive financial projections and promised record-breaking returns for investors. When Bennett Capital's turn arrived, several audience members barely looked up from their notes. They expected another routine proposal from a much smaller company. David walked to the podium carrying no flashy presentation, only the same worn notebook that had accompanied him since his first day at the firm. He began by telling the story of a warehouse employee who spent 3 extra hours every night because outdated transportation routes delayed deliveries across the city. Then he spoke about a family-owned grocery store losing customers because supply trucks regularly arrived late. Finally, he described a young father who once walked 4 miles to a job interview because reliable public transportation failed to connect his neighborhood with the business district. He never mentioned that the father was himself. Instead, he explained that infrastructure was not about roads or buildings. It was about giving ordinary people the chance to build extraordinary lives. Only after establishing that message did David present Bennett Capital's financial plan. Every investment recommendation was supported by real experiences gathered from the communities the project would serve. By the time he finished, the room that had expected another forgettable presentation rose to its feet in applause. Even executives from competing firms nodded respectfully. 2 weeks later, Bennett Capital received the official decision. Against every prediction, the city selected their proposal. Employees erupted in celebration as reporters crowded outside the office building. Charles quietly stepped aside, allowing David to address the media for the first time. Standing before dozens of cameras, David thanked the city for its confidence, but reminded everyone that the victory belonged to every employee who believed integrity could compete with size. That evening, Bennett Capital hosted a celebration attended by clients, city officials, and employees with their families. Noah proudly wore his first small suit and spent the evening introducing himself as his father's biggest fan. Watching him laugh with Charles brought tears to David's eyes. Just months earlier, they had shared hamburgers inside a parked car, wondering how they would survive another week. Now they stood surrounded by people celebrating what had once seemed impossible. As the evening drew to a close, Charles asked everyone for one final moment of attention. Holding a glass in his hand, he announced that after decades of leading Bennett Capital, he had